The British officers of Meerut never reached their horses. On the night of May 10, 1857, sepoys of the Bengal army sealed every road out of the cantonment before the alarm could spread, and by dawn the entire European officer corps of the station was in rebel hands. For decades, the mutiny at Meerut had been remembered as a sudden, chaotic explosion, a thing of panic and flight. But the immediate cause was no mystery to the men who lived it. The new Enfield rifle cartridge, rumored to be greased with the fat of cows and pigs, had offended Hindu and Muslim sepoys alike, and on May 9, 85, troopers of the 3rd Light Cavalry had been court-martialed and imprisoned for refusing it. What changed everything was not the anger. It was the timing. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Meerut held an unusually large European garrison, including the 6th Dragoon Guards and the 60th Rifles, and in our history that strength let the British survive the night and ride out their advantage. Here, the sepoys moved first. They captured the arsenal intact, freed the imprisoned cavalrymen, and held their officers as hostages rather than scattering them across the countryside. By the morning of May 11, they were marching on Delhi, disciplined, armed, and unbroken. But what no one in London yet understood was that a single night's difference would not stay contained to a single city. The rebellion did not crawl. It raced, with the Meerut officers held and the cantonment's communications in rebel hands. Couriers carried word south and west, faster than the company could carry its denials. In the real rebellion, the rising stayed largely a Bengal affair, and the Bombay and Madras armies held loyal long enough for the British to recover. Here, the news arrived as proof of success rather than rumor of disorder. Regiments that had wavered now saw a rising that had already won its first night. The company's great weakness was arithmetic. Its army depended on Indian sepoys, who vastly outnumbered British troops across the subcontinent, and communications still ran by horse, river steamer, and a thin telegraph network, days or weeks between presidencies. That delay had once been Britain's shield, the time it needed to concentrate force. Now it became the rebellion's weapon. Before Calcutta could order suppression, regiments in the Bombay and Madras presidencies rose alongside Bengal. 3 armies, not one. The company faced not a fire to be stamped out, but a fire on every side at once. In Delhi sat an old man with a pension and a title and nothing else. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, held only ceremonial authority within the walls of the Red Fort, a relic the company tolerated because he was harmless. The rebels proclaimed him Emperor of Hindustan, and this time the proclamation was not empty. Advised by the able commander Bakht Khan and by councils of rebel officers, the restored court began to do what a government does. It issued revenue orders. It confirmed appointments. It collected taxes through officials who, for the first time in a generation, obeyed a Mughal seal rather than a company one. The emperor himself remained cautious, an aging man pushed toward a throne he had not sought. But authority once exercised hardens. Each order that was obeyed made the next order more credible. The company had always insisted that the Mughal was a fiction. The rebellion was turning that fiction into a fact. And the regions still watching, the Punjab, the Deccan, were beginning to calculate. The Punjab had been annexed by the company only in 1849, after the hard-fought Anglo-Sikh wars, and many Sikhs had initially sided with the British against the Bengal sepoys, old enemies of the Mughal, wary of a Delhi resurgence. The British counted on that loyalty. It was the hinge of any reconquest, the gateway through which reinforcements and supply would have to flow, but loyalty is a transaction, and the company could no longer pay. With 3 presidencies aflame, no army could be spared to march north and reward the Punjab's chiefs. Rebel envoys arrived instead, offering what the company never would: restored Sikh autonomy, self-rule guaranteed under a weak and distant Mughal rather than a grasping and present one. The chiefs weighed a far throne against a near master. One by one, they withdrew their support and closed the northwestern supply line. The consequences of this would prove decisive, but first we must follow the bargaining south to the Deccan. The Maratha Confederacy had once ruled much of India, and its leaders had neither forgotten that nor forgiven the company for ending it. Now they saw an opening. The restored Mughal court needed legitimacy across the south. The Marathas needed the company gone. The arithmetic was simple. They recognized Bahadur Shah Zafar as emperor, and in exchange secured written guarantees of self-rule across the Deccan. It was a deliberate trade, a distant, ceremonial overlord in Delhi in place of a centralizing administration in Calcutta. The Mughal name cost the Marathas little and gained them everything. With Maratha recognition, the rebellion ceased to be a mutiny of soldiers and became a coalition of powers. The company now held coastline and little else. By 1858, the East India Company was governing an account book, not a country. It held coastal enclaves, Calcutta, Bombay, Madras, and it was bleeding money to hold even those. Every month of war drained revenue that no longer arrived from an interior that no longer obeyed. In London, Parliament did the arithmetic the directors could not bring themselves to do. A full reconquest would mean a vast army, years of war, and a cost no government could justify to its taxpayers. The will was not there. Through 1859, the company negotiated an evacuation, trading an orderly departure for the safety of its people and its remaining trade. Britain did not collapse. It simply declined to pay the price of staying. And then came the settlement that would define everything that followed. India did not become one nation. It became many. What emerged was a loose patchwork, a weak Mughal presidency in Delhi holding precedence but little command, surrounded by restored and self-governing powers. The Marathas governed the Deccan. The Sikh chiefs held the Punjab. Southern rulers and princely states administered their own revenue and their own armies. It was not a peaceful order, and it was not a doomed one. Borders were disputed, courts intrigued against one another. The Mughal seal carried weight in some provinces and none in others. But it was Indian rule, answerable to Indian powers, and it endured. The subcontinent had traded a single foreign administration for a crowded, quarreling, living political world of its own. Britain's mid-Victorian wealth had drawn deeply on India, on its revenue, its raw cotton, and a captive market of millions for British-manufactured goods. After 1859, that engine was gone. Not destroyed, but closed to British command. The effect was not catastrophe. It was friction. British factories paid more for cotton and sold into markets they no longer controlled. Late Victorian expansion still came, but slower, costlier, smaller. And the room Britain did not fill, others did. Rival powers found more space in Asia and Africa, and the century that historians would later call British became merely one century among several. The world had not ended. It had only divided. The true measure of an empire, this timeline suggests, is not the battles it wins, but the single night it cannot afford to lose.